It is my role now to introduce our keynote speaker for today. And there's a pretty easy bridge from Renaud to Pierre Regibeau, because both have a common feature that a lot of you probably ignore. Both are native from the place where I held my PhD, Liège in Belgium. So that will not be the end of the introduction of our keynote speaker for today. It's not really easy to introduce Pierre Regibeau, who is currently chief economist at the Directorate General for Competition in the European Commission. And when I asked Pierre to give me a biography, what I received was inversely correlated to his generosity and his publication track. I received 5 lines, very dense, very terse, very to the point, and I didn't have a lot to think about and about how to best explain who Pierre is. So I'll give you the sort of usual. Give you something that I learned on the roads from my interactions with Pierre. So Pierre has spent a lot of time at UC Berkeley, where David and Beau are spending a lot of time today. Got his PhD in economics. Pierre has a very rich academic career. He taught at MIT, Northwestern University, and the University of Essex. He then moved to private practice, working for a large economic consultancy firm for a lot of years, dealing with cases, with the hard stuff of making sense of cases, helping clients, helping policymakers understand, again, the complex reality of business behavior and industry structure. And on top of that, and beside this, Pierre has nurtured a very lots of works on standardization, intellectual property, digitalization, and competition policy. Now, enough with the official biography and more about the personal stuff. So I did some research on Google, following a discussion. You have a right to be forgotten, but I can't exercise it on your behalf. You would have to go there. Remembering a discussion we had last year at the CRES conference in Greece, and Pierre was very keen over the dinner table to talk about wine. And did a little bit of search on Google, and what did I stumble on? In 2015, Pierre was the co-author of a study on the determinants of wine markups. Does more competition lead to more uniformity? So my interest was aroused by that first discovery, and I dig further, and I realized that Pierre had a line of research devoted to wine economics. In 2021, while a chief economist, Pierre co-authored a CPR discussion paper on price dispersion in wines. Okay, so that led me to investigate further and further, only to realize that Pierre was a member of the very august scientific committee of the European Wine Economics Association. I just had to wonder what the discussions are at the table of the scientific committee of the year. Exactly, where are we going to organize our next conference? Burgundy, Argentina, or Tuscany? What kind of drinks are we going to have to accompany the dinner? Wine, reds, what kind of grapes, what kind of millésime, and this and that. So I even wondered if conferences involve coffee breaks or another types of break. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I couldn't think of a better environment to have our keynote speaker today, the heart of Tuscany, north of Chianti, the region full of, wine history. We are providing you with, in a way, a natural habitat or a perfect aquarium for Pierre to distill. I'm playing the pun sing a little too hard. To distill his wisdom. Pierre, we are absolutely delighted to have you here today. And the floor is yours for the keynote speech.
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to this absolutely gorgeous place. I will have to rush a little bit with the presentation because I thought I had, a full 30+ minutes plus time for question. We only have 30 minutes together. So apologies if I rush a bit, and apologies if I have to jump over some stuff. We can discuss it later. And now, dynamics has been mentioned very often in the past of competition policy, mostly on the stand, when in difficulty, the usual answer was yes, but in a dynamic world, everything is different. So now, however, we are confronted with a number of sectors where clearly dynamic elements matter. So to rejoin what Nicolas said, if we want to remain relevant, we've got to adapt to this increased importance of dynamics. So this talk is going to be a set of thoughts about how we might do this. What are the relevant dynamics? Have we already dealt with them? What are kind of some of the issues that arise, and some of the inherent limitation about what we can do? Now, that's what my secretary always add, because I always forgets. Anybody who knows me knows that what I'm going to say cannot possibly reflect the official line of the European Commission. So often this is a bit of a confusion, is that if you talk to people within the Commission, and the people were so inflamed about the decision in the Siemens Armstrong, they say, oh, you don't understand the issue dynamics. What does it mean? It means you do not look at long enough horizons when making the decision. And then, that's a completely separate issue. You can have long horizon without dynamics. On the other hand, clearly, if you have dynamics, you need long enough horizon. So in practice, how have we dealt with longer time horizon? It is a fable to think that when we do merger review, we only look at, the 2 years horizon, which is mentioned in whatever relevant guidelines. When we look at mergers or antitrust, we look at the horizon that is the relevant one. Let me give you an example. That's a case in a merger that was actually abandoned in the shipbuilding business. In this business, the order books were for 10 years, right? Now, clearly, we're not going to look at the effects of the merger within the next 2 years in such a situation, right? Because any action today will only impact things in 10 years. And therefore also, that means that the relevant relevant dimension is also not only output decision, but capacity expansion decision. Okay? So in that case, we took a time horizon of 15 to 20 years. So yes, it's important sometimes to have a look at longer horizon, but this is something we actually already do. Now, if you look at antitrust and those defensive foreclosure cases, a la old Microsoft case, i.e. the reason why you degrade the operability between Windows OS and the OS of Sun and all of the station is because in the longer term, if those stations develop their own OS will become popular, and therefore the application might start being written for this OS directly rather than from Windows, therefore decreasing the initial source of dominance for Windows. Well, that's definitely a dynamic story. That's also definitely a story that would take some time to unfold. You cannot look at this story over a 1 or 2 years horizon. Now, also, if you look at efficiencies, merger-specific efficiencies do not happen overnight. Actually, it's probably a reasonable bet to say that in the first 1 or 2 years after mergers, you have inefficiencies due to the cost of merging the two firms, the two cultures together. So if we take efficiencies, positive efficiencies of a merger seriously, we also have to allow for longer-term horizon. Now, the thing that is important in doing this is to avoid the fallacy of using one type of horizon for the harm and one type of horizon for the benefits, which some consultants are very kind of eager to try to convince us of doing. If you consider longer-term horizons, you consider longer-term horizon for both cost and benefit. Now, what is the issue of standard of proof if you use longer-term horizon? And clearly, things that are further in the future are a little harder to predict, a little harder to get information about, the things that are closer to us. Generally speaking, you don't feel too bad if both the costs and benefits arise kind of over the same kind of horizon, because essentially you're going to have to live with the kind of burden of proof that you can have for something that's going to happen to 8 years, as long as you do not, by doing so, introduce a bias between the positive side and the negative side of the trade-off. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if there are both short-term effect and long-term effect, then I would suggest that not only we need to do the usual discounting to reflect the rate of time preference and so on, but I would add an additional discounting to indicate the fact that we are less certain about the longer term effect than about the short term effect. And then finally, another thing that we should take into account is that there might be systematically some effects that are kind of harder to predict than others. And one point to which I will come back later is that for me, one such effect is the probability of entry, and especially the probability for entry triggered by a merger. This is something we're actually very, very bad at predicting, and therefore I would put a relatively low weight on that. So that was for kind of false dynamics, but still referring to the issue of horizon and burden of proof, which is quite present in the current debate. Now, what about dynamics? And there too, people sometimes mention dynamics to reflect two different phenomena. One, which is the one I'm going to talk about mostly today, is how do we do competition policy faced with a dynamic world? The second one is that some people have also suggested that competition policy itself could be dynamics. That could be ex post review and change of the decision based on what's going to happen and all of those things. Okay? So given that my presentation is going to be a bit shorter than planned, I will today only talk about the competition policy for a dynamic world, but I'm happy to talk over coffee about the other topic with whoever would be interested. So now, what are the main sources of dynamics in the sectors that we look at? That's not rocket science, clearly. Investment introduce some dynamic elements. What you do today is going to have not only lasting consequences, but is going to affect the choice set of both the firm involved and its rival in the future. So might have a lasting, a kind of complex secondary effect over time. So same thing clearly for innovation. And we also know, of course, about dynamic economies of scale, be it learning by doing, or more popular in the context of competition policy, kind of network effects, things that go back to, Brian Arthur's study of tipping markets and so on. These clearly are sources of dynamics. And these are sources of dynamics we are fairly familiar with. Now, more and harder to understand is what I would call ecosystem dynamics. I will come back to this in a little bit more detail, but the idea is that if you're in a world where you have ecosystems that compete between them, but also with firms that are not part of ecosystem, then the order in which things kind of happen might actually matter. Whether a company is acquired by a single product firm or by an ecosystem might matter. When it is acquired by an ecosystem might matter. The ecosystem itself might be modified significantly through this acquisition in the sense that the center of gravity of this ecosystem might be modified. So that's an issue of ecosystem dynamics that I think we should think about, but we haven't done much of so far. Clearly, sunk cost, commitment, anything that has to do with commitment, not commitment in the legal term, but commitment in the economic term, is a crucial element of dynamics. Entry, exit are an important element of industry dynamics. Collusion dynamics, we know we've been doing this probably to death, probably too much. I'm not a great fan of most of the theory of collusion, so I'm not going to talk a lot about this. But it's also interesting that some behavioral biases on the consumer side can introduce or reinforce some dynamics, some dynamic dimension of the sector, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Okay. Now, we have actually over the years dealt with cases and explicit dynamics at work. In terms of investments, there are a number of cases where we actually do look into what, say, for example, a merger might do to incentive to invest. In the Novelis Polaris merger, for example, there we were worried about the incentive to invest of the remedy takers, right? If in the Chet network, all of the inquiry essentially was on the effect of this agreement, on the incentive of the members as part of the network sharing agreement on different kind of investment, mast, all the things and so on, in different kind of part of the country. I've already mentioned shipbuilding. In Jastel Orange, the whole reason why the mergers was actually permitted in the long term is that we managed to convince the commission that actually by putting two smaller players together, that would foster more intense competition into internet backbones, internet facility in Spain against the dominant firm, Telefónica. Interestingly, the BHB Rio Tinto mentioned, it's a case that never happened, it was withdrawn, but that was one I was involved in as a consultant. And the interesting thing in that case is that the internal modeling of the companies, and because of very big, serious companies, they actually had internal modeling not only of the pricing decision, but of the long-term investment decision. So what we were able to do there was try use this modeling to actually see and try to determine how those investment plans will be altered by the merger. And that's already maybe, one pre-conclusion of one small conclusion of my presentation is that when we kind of look for data and sources of information, we try to apprehend the dynamics of an industry, which is not easy. Sometimes referring to the tools, the internal tools that the companies themselves develop to deal with this issue is something that competition policy might do a little bit more of. In innovation, we've dealt with it, a lot over the last few years, and also people will talk about it, so I'm not going to spend too much time. Network effects were really present in the Microsoft stories that I just told. Another effect is that if you walk the corridor of DG.com, you think that every single market is about to tip. So maybe being a little bit more rigorous as to what is tipping and when it is likely to occur is one of the things on the agenda of what we should do in order to deal with dynamics in a more serious matter. Right? Now, for ecosystem dynamics, we haven't done much. We have some regrets about WhatsApp and Instagram with the idea that what appears now as one element in an ecosystem might have been kind of the central kernel that would have, created a rival ecosystem, that overall maybe competition would have been more intense in this alternative world. Clearly, when you look at the failing firm defense, this is a dynamic theory, not of harm, but here of excuse the mergers. And then, as you know, entries everywhere. Since the Siemens Alstom case, as you know, the Chinese are coming. The Chinese are coming in every single mergers, essentially, that we have probably looked at ever since the Siemens Alstom merger. But clearly, entry, and especially entries that will be triggered by the mergers that would not otherwise occur, is an important aspect of dynamics. And we have had to deal with that in almost every single case. So when you look at this, clearly we've dealt with dynamic situation, dynamic theory of harm. Okay? However, maybe not enough. And there are issues, there are sectors in which we probably should go more explicitly dynamic. And one that you might find kind of a bit out of place here is this IC test. Following the Intel judgment, where I had the privilege of going to court to different case that was run by Damien Evans, the court took a very, very narrow interpretation of the as efficient competitor test. It really has to be an as efficient competitor, and the burden of evidence is really quite high. If you cannot show that the test is violated and is violated under almost every possible variation of the numbers, then you're in trouble. Now, of course, as economists, we don't really like the as efficient competitor test very much. Why? First, in a very static way, we know that having a market with one more firm, even if it's not that efficient, tends to give you more competitive outcome than if you don't have it. So why should we close our eyes if a practice will eliminate that firm? But more importantly than that, I think that often one of the reasons we don't like the as efficient competitor test is that we have a dynamic view of things. I want to defend firms that might not be as efficient right now, but are likely or at least could become as efficient over the longer run, precisely through the exploitation of a variety of dynamic economies of scale, or through just achieving static economies of scale at some point. And my view there is that we should essentially stop complaining about the court not understanding that. And what we should do is, when we trot out theories of harm in cases like this, is make sure that this dynamic view, this dynamic story is explicit there. So we should run explicitly dynamics theory of harm. And if we do that, actually, I'm not sure that we will have that many problems with the court anymore. Now, in terms of ecosystem dynamics, there are essentially kind of two issues. There is the old issue of, look, what might look like a substitute, a complement now, might become a substitute later. Again, that's the old WhatsApp, Instagram. It looks like right now, when you acquire it, it would be, you know, a nice complement to the Facebook ecosystem. But on the other hand, it might either turn into a closer substitute as you go from pictures to more, you know, Facebook type of network and so on. Or if one of these becomes itself the center of an ecosystem, which then as an ecosystem becomes a substitute to the ecosystem of the acquiring company, kind of Facebook. Okay? So paying attention to the evolving substitution complementarity link between different products as the industry develops is something we have to get more used to. Now, again, as I've already mentioned, when you have system competition and you have, for example, a merger, how do you assess that? First, clearly, you have to make sure that the acquiring firm, being a system or not, does not have too much horizontal overlap with what you have acquired. But that's not enough. Even if it passes that test, you have to worry if the acquirer is an ecosystem, whether even without horizontal overlap, this acquisition would essentially further twist the balance of power between ecosystem and single product firm in the industry. Okay? And that's, you know, that's a challenge that we can understand conceptually, but we actually haven't really developed the tool to deal with this. Ask yourself the following question. You start with a configuration with a few stars, a few ecosystem, and a bunch of, you know, one product firms hanging around in the universe. Suppose one of those firms become available. Would we be better off with this firm being acquired by another single product firm or by one of the ecosystems? We don't know the answer. Just as a matter of theory, of modeling, we don't know the answer. And then even if we knew that, there would be an extra step of going from this understanding to the empirical things that we might look at in order to guide us in a decision. So while we understand that ecosystem are a source of potentially complex dynamics, this is definitely one of the areas where more work is needed. Okay. Now, when you look at sunk cost entry and exit, you have to distinguish between several things. There's the entry that would occur anyway, whether you have a merger or not, for example. That's essentially irrelevant, right? This kind of cancels out in the counterfactual. So what we are really interested in is a specific dynamic, something that would happen as a consequence of the action of merging. Okay? Now, we kind of look at entry being triggered by merger, but it's not that hard to think of scenarios in which actually a merger could block entry. And that's another kind of dynamics to which we do not pay enough attention, or if we do, is just through somewhat narrow lens of foreclosure. Now, if we want to look a little bit more into the dynamics of entry and so on, which is an important topic, you could do worse than reading a recent paper by Cardona, Miller, this is Nathan Miller, Georgetown, and Shaw. And what they ask is precisely the following question. You have a game where you have a bunch of firms in the industry, two of them will merge, and there's a potential entrant sitting outside of the industry. Right? This is a merger, this is entry decision, this is competition on prices. And in this graph, you have the merger efficiency on the vertical axis, and you have the relative efficiency of the incumbent compared to the entrant on the horizontal axis. Don't have enough time to really explain the graph to you now, given that I have less time than I thought. But essentially what you see is that there's only this red area kind of in the middle, where actually the fact that there is entry could make a merger that otherwise would have been anti-competitive, pro-competitive in the sense that it increased consumer surplus. Let's not worry too much about how this result is achieved, but let's focus on basic tension that tells you very much about what's happening in the model. First, if there is entry, then in order for the merger to be profitable, efficiencies have to be high, right? But if the efficiencies are high, then it's call order for the entrant to come in and compete with the firm. So again, it tells you that given this tension, it's going to be a bit hard to think of this kind of entry as a very strong disciplining factor. Another way of putting this into the model is that to have a disciplining effect of merger-induced entry in their model, this entry actually has to occur not in a place close to the merger, but in a place fairly far away from the mergers. But then, of course, the merger itself does not create much additional incentive to merge for somebody who would enter away from the merger as opposed to close to the merger. So there's a kind of important tensions that you get in this kind of framework, which is kind of, I think, very interesting. I'll come back to this in a second. So where does it leave me? From our point of view, I think essentially that we pay way too much attention to entry. We've known for a long time, no, this was not the first people to mention it, so there was some paper by Verden, Chance, and Freud a long time ago, that you cannot really look at entry and efficiency as two independent excuses for a merger, because they're related. My view of this is because entry, future entry, especially future entries that will be triggered a merger, is very, very, very difficult to understand and to get information on. You're trying to get information on the action of somebody who is not part of the transaction, therefore on which you might not get any innovation, and it has to be conditional to the merger. Frankly, I'm not sure we can do a very good job on entry anyway. Therefore, for me, this is one more argument for putting much more work in efficiencies. Because from the previous analysis, we know that actually, when you look at the two together, to some extent, having sufficiently high efficiencies is a bit of a sufficient statistic. It's good as efficiency too. And we also saw on the graph that the efficiencies have been high enough in order for the possibility of entry to also help. Now, going a little bit back to other aspects of entry, as David would be more familiar with those things. There's some things that was pointed a long time ago and that we haven't really paid too much attention to, which is entry is not just a one-off. There are kind of entry paths. You can start in biotech and go to life science. You can go from B to B to B to C, from one country to the other. And there are, of course, many more kind of more much complex entry paths into a given sector. And first, we really haven't paid too much attention. When we look at potential of entry deterrence, we look really in the neighborhood of the final target market. So strategies aim at putting roadblocks kind of further away, earlier on in those entry paths, is definitely something that we should think about. Now, of course, if you want to go a little deeper in this, you say, why are there such entry paths? Why do they feel kind of the need to kind of go through that? Well, one is that possibly is the learning, but one important element is that for such meaningful entry paths, it must be that those firms have some kind of competency, of skill, of resources that are actually potentially useful across a bunch of markets, and that they build up their competency on the way to the final target market. So in that sense, kind of a natural link between the resources used as a firm and this kind of study of entry paths. How am I doing on time? What? 23 minutes. Okay. So in terms of behavioral biases, I'll be fact. There's a bunch of behavioral biases, but essentially there are a lot of those that tend to lead to greater entrenchment by incumbent. People are myopic. People tend to be faced to kind of very nasty companies and so on. There are strategies to increase lock-in. We should pay attention to this. That's one more reason to kind of push interoperability, as we try to do in the DMA and so on. And so on. Now, another aspect, of course, is free riding, right? In the sense that often it's not just that people are myopic or kind of do not see a benefit in switching, but switching usually has also a benefit in the sense that it increases competition for others. And that's a very kind of rational, it's not a bad, it's a very rational reason why consumer pressure is not always sufficient to enforce competition, to enforce competitive pressures on dominant firms. Now, what kind of tools and data might we want to have? Now, the usual economist reaction is to say, hey, models dynamic, therefore we need dynamic models. On the slide, what the state of this kind of dynamic modeling is and how usable it is. You will see I'm quite skeptical of it. In my view, a much more promising approach is to just use simple decision trees. Okay? Not even necessarily looking for equilibria in those trees and so on, but simple decision trees. After all, if you look at some of the more adventurous dynamic theory of arms that have been ventured lately, for example, within the ongoing Microsoft Activision, there have been theories of arms that are well known, saying, game are an important part of the future of the cloud. Therefore, you can use game on the cloud to increase your dominance on the cloud. Then you can use the dominance on the cloud to discriminate against rival browsers. And then in the end, that helps keep your existing dominance on operating system for desktop and something like that. I'm not commenting here on the theory of ARM itself, but just pointing out that this is a multi-step theory of harm. And if we use those kind of decision tree, what it reminds us to do is that we have to justify and provide evidence from every single one of those steps. Now, the standard of evidence might be loosened a bit because, if you've got to prove evidence for 4 steps, it's a bit harder than for 2, but still, you have to provide evidence. And this evidence should not everybody knows that games is the future of the cloud or da-da-da-da-da-da. No, evidence, numbers, expert opinion, not the expert opinions that happens to fit your theory of harm. Now, in terms of data, you need, unfortunately, if you're going to do dynamics, you need kind of long series of data on price, on output, on advertising, on innovation, on investment. So whoever wants to invest in developing this kind of data set, that would be very welcome. There will not be some serious dynamic analysis without such data set. You also do need data on network effect. As I say, I'm getting a little sick of everybody thinking that every market is about to tip, while when you step back and try to identify markets that actually have tipped, there are few and far between. Therefore, we need kind of better metrics, better data to help us actually foresee which markets are going to tip and which markets are not going to tip. And one natural thing to do is to compare the evolution of market share to see, for example, if market share, the new customers, increase or decrease compared to historical market share and so on. But that clearly means that we need some fairly kind of extensive and detailed data on market share, which everybody knows is not something that comes by very easily. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, that also means that we should make use of the internal resources of the firm involved and some of their rivals, use the internal data, use the internal modeling, even get them to use and perform experiments if they're willing to do so. Now, the last thing is really about those models, about the dynamic of competition in the sense of dealing with the dynamic environment, is those models of dynamic competition. I essentially start with mostly with Maskins and Tirol. Those 2 great papers where they look at alternative move, but that was never meant to be a model of dynamic competition to be used. It was a model of dynamic competition to show the robustness or not of our usual results to the small change of having alternative move in what happens in the limit. So it was a very good paper, but very theoretical with not much policy. After that, you have essentially kind of 2 schools. There's this empirical modeling school, a la Bresnahan or a la Packes. These are models that are fairly general, but precisely they're very general because they don't really model much of the precise sector that you look at. And that, to me, is a problem, because my understanding of dynamics is that theory of harms in the dynamic world are going to tend to be very industry specific. They're really going to depend on, the history of the firms, the business models, institutional framework, and so on. So the ability of this kind of more black box dynamic models of competition to capture something essential about this industry seems to be very limited. But precisely the problem then is that you can build models that are more adapted. Some have been built for the airline industry, for example, and some actually have done a very good job on very specific industries. The problem there is that, quite frankly, this is something that I would consider in antitrust because we have time in antitrust. But within the confine of merger at the time schedules that we face, that is not something that I see us frankly ever doing. So again, just as I mentioned before, looking at decision tree, not at full model, I think that's the way to go. The overall implication is that we should definitely pay more attention to dynamics. And we should walk we run. Again, if you have a dynamic theory with 5 or 6 steps, the probabilities that you're going to document each of these steps well now with the kind of data we have available and so on is not good. And if we start getting those theory, even if we think they're very good theory, try to push them without sufficient evidence, that's going to set bad precedent because the courts are going to tell us we're full of it. And this image is going to stuck. Dynamics equal you're full of it. And we will have, killed the change that we want to implement. So I think we have to be modest and start with fairly modest theory of harm, 2-step, 3-step theory of harm, and make sure that we document each of these steps very, very carefully. So to conclude, what we need are dynamic theory of harm. We do not need fables or conspiracy theories. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pierre. Very nice speech and very helpful conclusion. It's a hard line to chart, the world of fables and dreams and the world of the hard reality. We have time for 2 questions for the chief economist. David Thies has a question, and Wolfgang.
Pierre, thank you very much. I have one comment and one question. The comment is, when you talk dynamics, you're talking time. When I talk dynamics, I'm talking both time and innovation, sort of an innovation first approach. So there's a little bit of a tension between what we're doing in the dynamic competition initiative and some of what you're characterizing as dynamics. Of course, it's dynamics, but there's another element to it. But the real question I want to put to you is the following. You talk about dynamic efficiency. The innovation literature says you can be efficient or you can be innovative. So there's no such thing as dynamic efficiency in the innovation literature because there's an inherent trade-off. If you try and innovate, you're going to give up production efficiencies for sure. And I see an effort to sort of squeeze everything into an efficiency framework. That's the way economists are trained to think. But the view of some of us in the dynamic competition initiative is the gig's up on that, because it's fundamentally preventing us from looking at innovation as the primary driver of competition. So I would like your comment on whether you see dynamic efficiency as an oxymoron in the sense that innovation and at least production efficiencies are antithetical to each other.
First, clearly, innovation and investment are important aspects of dynamics. I mentioned on my slide, I focused on the less popular, less discussed aspect, which is more the A goes B, Z goes C, and so on, which, as you say, is a much more economics way to look at it. I certainly would not discount innovation. I'm on record as saying that we spend probably too much time looking at static losses while ignoring potential dynamic innovation-related losses that are likely to be kind of much more sizable. I also agree, and that's something that I've observed, is that one has, while economic models of innovation gives you, basic insight about this effect going this way, this effect going that way. When you look at an actual case, it helps to know how firms innovate. So some knowledge of management of technology and so on would be very, very important. I've actually been very frustrated because, I have some of that background, and you realize that within DG almost nobody knows. They don't know how R&D works. They don't know how lab are organized. You know, redundancy, encouraging failure, all of this kind of stuff. The important part of running innovation, therefore must be an important part of innovation competition, are ignored. So clearly getting into the black box of innovation and including at least some of the simpler, more robust consequences of this into competition policy is something which is needed.
Thank you.
Wolfgang Karber, University of Marburg. I have a very similar question as David's. We are here for a conference of dynamic competition, and from my perspective, I come from a Schumpeterian perspective, dynamic competition is innovation competition, therefore this is a bit similar. And I was a bit surprised that innovation played only a very little small role in what you talked about in dynamic. Is not innovation something which is part of competition, and therefore something which should be much more explicitly here used, and which might also require a different basic economic approach, going outside of what already was a discussion about this efficiency approach and static competition approach. So perhaps you can respond a bit on more general term, because we have this whole conference about dynamic competition. I think we also want to think a bit more broadly about the concepts.
Again, it's a very simple answer. This is what I chose to talk about. I've talked about innovation and competition policy, and I've written about it over the last few years. There's been a lot of debate on this. So that's why I mentioned innovation, and I said I'm not going to say much about it because other people are going to discuss it today. So don't take this at all as my not thinking that it is important. After all, I've worked in innovation, intellectual property rights, and so on. So it would be a little bizarre for me not to acknowledge the crucial role of innovation. So here, precisely, I chose to look at the aspect kind of less travel, which doesn't mean that I think we've done enough on innovation, but at least there on innovation, the conversation has been started and is going on. So I just chose to talk about the other aspect.
Okay, thank you very much. We now